So I'm going to introduce our very special guest here. Many people know him from his Emmy award-winning work at The Guardian on the graphics team, or his work on Ractive, or his work on Rollup, or from his front end of master's course, any point in his illustrious career. But if you're here, you probably know him as the creator of Svelte. So I'd like to introduce Rich Harris. Please everybody give him a round of applause.
Hi, nice to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. So generous of you to come. I know you're extremely busy. It's wonderful to have you here. Before we get directly into Svelte, I want to hear a little bit about how you started out. I mean, I know I just watched that the Offer Zen documentary that came out, which is really great. And you talked about beginning to code for the graphics team and things like that. Can you tell us a little bit about the journey? You just starting out, you're getting into coding while you're working in journalism.
Yeah, so the short version is that I started out in journalism and quickly realized that it's a terrible industry where people just lose their jobs at a moment's notice. And I've been laid off as a journalist. I think most people that I know who've worked in journalism have been laid off at some point. And it was like a fairly cynical calculation that I needed to make myself more employable. But also, like, learning to code is this thing that gives you, I mean, I don't want to over romanticize it, but like if you can write code, then you have a kind of a superpower. You can do things within your existing job that are very hard unless you have the power of automation. And in the case of journalism, that meant being able to produce interactive pieces, data visualizations, all those sorts of things. And I was working at a financial publication where like we dealt with data all the time, and it was very natural to want to be able to do quantitative journalism and visual journalism that used data in some way, and we just weren't doing it because like we didn't know how. And so slowly at first, and then all at once, I started tinkering with JavaScript in order to do that kind of work.
Kind of speculate a bit, or tell us a bit about what you think the impact of journalists learning to code has had on news in general.
I mean, I don't think I think we should be careful not to overstate it. It's like there's this meme in the news industry that everyone should learn to code, and it's a little demeaning, honestly, as if journalists who can code are more valuable than journalists who can't, when in reality, like, journalism is this very broad tent, and it covers like so many different but related jobs and so many different skills, and writing code is just one very small piece of that puzzle. But I do think that culturally, journalism has always kind of turned its nose up a little bit at things like numeracy. Journalists are always very self-effacing about how they're not numbers people, and that's like a really shameful thing to admit when your job is to understand and report the world, and do so in a way that improves the understanding of your readers. Then being able to be hoodwinked by misleading statistics, or being unable to explain what numbers mean, is like a really terrible position to be in. And I think that the main impact that I've seen of the rise of the hybrid journalist coder is that in newsrooms across the country, and indeed across the world, people place a higher stock on visual and quantitative journalism, and I think that's been super beneficial when we think about stories like the pandemic. Like, having people in newsrooms who understand things like exponential curves has been a real boon. And obviously that's not like completely correlated to the ability to write JavaScript, but you tend to find that there is a pretty strong overlap between people who wrangle code and people who have a solid grasp of mathematics and statistics. And I think that has probably been the most beneficial impact. But I don't know, I'm sure different people would answer that question in lots of different ways. That's just the main effect that I've personally seen.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. I think that can bring us to kind of our next question of, you are trying to get in on the, I don't know if trend is the right word, but you're starting to learn how to code as a journalist. Is there a moment that you would point to that was your inspiration for Svelte, or that you were kind of then knew what you had to go out and do? Yeah, what was it like when you first had the idea and began working?
There definitely wasn't like a single light bulb moment. So Svelte began in 2016, and that was the culmination of like thinking about various aspects of this problem space for a number of years by that point. Prior to Svelte, I worked on a framework called Ractive, and that was like entirely born out of my own frustration with how difficult it was to produce interactive applications on the web. And we've got to go back to like 2012, 2013, at this point when there really wasn't the same culture around tooling that there is now. We didn't have React, we didn't have like NPM wasn't really a thing yet. So, it was just hard. It was just incredibly hard to make stuff. And so I've been thinking about how to make that process easier, just from a completely selfish perspective, because I wanted my own job to be easier. But along the way, as I grew as a programmer, I realized all of the terrible mistakes that I had made. And I wanted to rectify those mistakes. I'd also been like tinkering with compilers. Back then, most browsers still ran ES5, but ES 2015 was coming out, and that meant that you had to use this very complex tool called Babel, which is still used, but is mercifully less common nowadays. And we very much didn't want to use Babel at The Guardian, because it slows your builds down and it bloats out the code that you've written in order to make it compatible with older browsers. So wrote a compiler that was like a rip-off of Babel called Buble, and then also wrote a module bundler called Rollup. And like all of these things involve taking code that's been written, turning it into a representation called an abstract syntax tree, and then transforming it in some way. And so like the combination of those two things, like thinking about like the productivity aspects of working with front-end frameworks, and then thinking about the capabilities that you have when you think about the code that someone has written as an input into a system rather than the thing that actually runs in the browser, just put me in a good place to start thinking about like, what if we think about our front-end frameworks as being compilers as well. And it fell out of some conversations that were happening at the time. There was one very influential conversation in particular that I had with the organizer of a local meetup. And also, like, people were, even more so than now, the JavaScript thought literati were very exercised about the fact that we were shipping too much JavaScript to browsers. Still a problem now, but back then, all of the tools that were written were kind of written with the assumption that they were going to be used in desktop browsers, and that was becoming very much not the case around then. And so, like, all of these things came to a head, and Svelte was the result. It really began as an experiment in like, how small can we make a JavaScript application if you just get rid of the machinery that runs your code, and just like try and pack it down to like very tightly optimized JavaScript. Can we make our application start faster? And can we also make applications update faster? Because, one of the things that you quickly find out when you try and build interactive data visualizations and other things like that in the context of a news article is that you're often dealing with like some pretty large data sets, and you need to represent a lot of different things on screen at once. And if you have if you're using a framework that is not really good at displaying things at 60 frames a second and animating them at 60 frames a second, then you're going to deliver like a suboptimal experience to your readers. And so that was the initial motivation. It's like, can we make this thing faster? And then the motivation has like evolved over the years. The rationale has evolved over the years, and I can perhaps talk about that, but that's where it all came from.
Yeah, so you mentioned briefly your first kind of front-end framework, the Ractive, which I think came out around the same time React did, right? They were kind of released relatively close to each other, and Ractive got some traction, didn't it? It was getting picked up by a couple of companies. You mentioned Yellow Pages, I think, and
the Yellow Pages is one. Yeah, it was used in a bunch of places. I mean, you've always got to like take the list of websites that use a particular tool with a little grain of salt, because you know, Delta Airlines used it, and I think Playboy TV used it at one point. And there's like a bunch of brands that people have heard of that were using it. But what is usually the case is, like, it's not like you have a team inside these companies that is building this stuff. Like they'll take a page and they'll farm it out to contractors who get to use whatever technology they want, and they're not concerned about like all of the other things that an engineering manager would normally have to worry about, like, can we maintain this for several years? Are we going to be able to hire people to maintain this 3 or 4 years from now? So like an easy way to get like, oh, these Fortune 500 companies use our thing. It's like, well, no, it's like some creative agency in Portland uses this thing and they just happen to get the gig. But yes, it had some traction. It had like a nice little community, but as you say, it came out around the same time as React. I remember quite vividly, I was getting ready to release the first version, or the first like acceptably public version of Ractive back in 2013. And I was maybe like 2 or 3 weeks away, and then React hits the front page of Hacker News. And most people looked at it and they were just horrified. They were like, this looks awful. Like, they just didn't get it at all. But having been thinking about this problem space for a long time, like I just saw that, oh, everything just changed. Because the solutions that they had come up with and the way that they had framed the problem that they were solving was so radically different and so far beyond what everyone else was thinking about at the time, that it was like kind of a dark day for me personally, because I was like, well, I may as well not bother. Which is, it turns out, is the wrong way to think about these things, because we do not live in a winner takes all environment, and there's a lot of room for competing technologies. But yeah, for a while I was like, oh, maybe my little project can compete with Facebook, but obviously it did not. And then here we are.
Can you say a little bit more on what's changed from Ractive to Svelte? Like, what makes Svelte special? I'm sure that you've brought a lot of it in, or you're using a similar thought process, but what really makes Svelte, you know, when compared to these older frameworks or compilers?
I mean, there's a lot of ways to answer that question. The initial version of Svelte was very much like Ractive, but with a compiler. Like, it had the same syntax, mostly. Like, the way that you would author components was very similar, and it was just faster. It was just a faster tool. You would build smaller applications, and that was really the main difference. But 3 years ago we launched Svelte 3, and we took that as an opportunity to just rethink what the authoring experience of components is like, because once you've got a compiler, you can do pretty much anything. And so and this is, I guess, my big thesis about how to think about designing tools like this is, we started with what we wanted the end user experience to be like, or not the end user, but the person using the framework. Like, what is it like for them to build a component using this thing? And we just kind of batted back and forth ideas about what the optimal way would be. And so things like the way that state is updated in Svelte, like, there's no API, you just use an assignment. You know, count plus equals 1. That is all that you need to do in order to update everything that references count. And so once we had that, we would then work backwards and think about like how to implement it, because the implementation is always the last thing that you need to worry about. A lot of people often worry about the implementation first and then like try and finesse the API later, and that is like the wrong way around. You've always got to start with the design first, I think. And so that is the main difference, is that we've thought deeply about like what we want people to experience as they're building stuff with the framework. Yeah.
So you touched on this briefly, but I wonder if we could get a little bit more on the kind of high level or very abstract look at how building a framework happens in terms of just the planning. Where do you start with that? And yeah, well, I mean, what are the steps like for anybody out there who is interested in building, maybe something similar?
I think the process probably differs a lot from team to team. For us, it always just starts with like almost just like a zany whiteboarding, like what if session. And we, it's a very iterative and evolutionary process that involves paying attention to what problems people are talking about, in spaces where people talk about code problems. Like on Twitter, a lot of people talk about, the fact that the main thread gets blocked when the page starts because you're doing some hydration. Like, okay, that's a thing that maybe we need to come up with a solution for. And so we just like synthesize all of the pain points that people are experiencing, and then just like, okay, complete blue sky, what could we do to fix this? And then we work backwards towards like a more concrete design that is generalizable. And now that we have a project that is already a thing, we have an RFC process where if people have an idea for like a sweeping change in how we tackle a certain topic, then we put together a request for comments, and just like talk in detail about like what the design might look like, what are the implications of that, like how, if we're going to implement it, like what is a high level view of how we would go about implementing it, what are the drawbacks of this, and then like those get debated usually for a very long time, until we decide, yep, this is the thing that we want to do, and then we go away and implement it. And the implementation is usually the quickest part. It's all of the back and forth and the reaching of consensus that takes all of the time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's bringing me to a question that's on the page here. And I want to read this one out just word for word, because I really like the wording. This is from Andy Zhang, who is a big Svelte fan. And he asks, or he says, Svelte is trending and the community loves it. What are the most in-demand things for us as contributors to help accelerate the evolution of the Svelte ecosystem? And what open source work is Svelte in need of most from the community?
This is such a good question. So as I talked to you today, there are, I think, 315 or so open issues on the SvelteKit repo, and most of those are blockers for our 1.0 release. And so like any help that we can get closing those issues is always going to be appreciated. The wrinkle, of course, is that in many cases, those issues don't have a very obvious solution. Like we need to talk about it and figure out what the right thing to do is. And in a lot of cases, there's like a lot of context required in order to solve the problem. And so that's why, like the mythical man month thing, like you can't just throw contributors at the problem and hope that it'll get solved, because a lot of these things, like they have to happen serially rather than concurrently. But that is definitely one good starting point. The trouble with a code base like Svelte is because it's code that writes code that like does stuff instead of just being code that does stuff. And so like the code base itself is pretty difficult, and we have some plans to completely change how the compilation step works in Svelte. And a lot of that stuff is like, it's really hard for a lot of people to solve that problem simultaneously. It's more like, okay, we need to down tools for a minute, and then one or two people are just going to put themselves in a darkened room for a couple of weeks and try and come up with a solution. So the question becomes like, how can contributors like make things that are beneficial like outside those two code bases, given that it's essentially blocked on like a few people at the core of the projects. And I think there's a few potential answers. Like people always want high quality component libraries and stuff like that. So that's a good example of something. Any kind of ancillary repositories like adapters for SvelteKit. So SvelteKit is this meta framework that you can build an application with Svelte in, and then you can deploy it anywhere. And we have official adapters for static exports, like just render everything as HTML files and then put it on GitHub pages or whatever. Vercel, obviously, because I work there. Netlify, very popular place to deploy Svelte apps, and also Cloudflare, either as workers or as Cloudflare pages. So those are like, oh, and also Node, like you can make a Node server. So those are the officially supported platforms. But there's a bunch of others that we don't officially support, and it would be great to have community support for those places as well. But I would say probably the single biggest impact contributions would be just building stuff with the framework, particularly if you can build stuff in the way that is open source, so that there is the stuff that people can look at and see, okay, so this is a thing that you can build and this is how it was built. Like being able to reverse engineer examples is always hugely beneficial. And it's also a really good way to stress test some of the ideas in the framework and see if there are, design mistakes that we've made. Like the more that you can push the framework to cover different problems, the more visibility we have into the edge cases that we need to think about as the core team. But yeah, I think about that question a lot, and I've never been able to come up with a truly satisfying answer, just because, as we all know, software development is like it's not a scalable thing. Like you can't double the productivity by doubling the number of people working on something. And so if other people have smart answers to that question, then I'm always very interested to hear them.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that answer is great, and Codesmith definitely has you covered with people building Svelte apps. We've got so many students here who are building Svelte apps that it's definitely adding to the ecosystem. But we can also look at the other direction. When is the time that we shouldn't be using Svelte if we're building out an application? Is there some place that you think that it's kind of lacking, where you still want to use maybe another framework or compiler? Is there something that a situation or use case that's not the right fit?
If you're building something as a mobile app, then React Native is probably your best bet today. And if you're building something with a large team and you're concerned about the long-term maintainability and you want to be able to hire people to work on that, then again, React is probably the right way to go, just because the ecosystem is so mature. Other than that, I don't think there are any kind of categories of application that Svelte is particularly ill-suited to. It is really just about whether there are integrations and tools out there that you need that only work with things like React. An example that came up the other day, there's a company that is in the process of migrating this awful legacy code base to a Svelte code base. And one of the blockers that they run into is that they use a continuous integration tool called SonarQube, which is a way of, I think what it does is it checks that the code that you're writing hasn't become so complex that people aren't going to be able to maintain it in future. It analyzes the cyclomatic complexity of your if statements and whatever. I don't know. And it doesn't work with Svelte. It works with regular JavaScript, and I think they have some special integrations for Vue, and they also work with JSX. But it doesn't know how to work with Svelte. And so because of that, this company, despite being pretty happy with Svelte in the main, they're like, well, our time to market is suffering because we don't have integrations with this tool. So those are the kinds of things that I think generally influence these sorts of decisions. It's not like, am I building an application that is ill-suited to Svelte? It's all of the ancillary stuff that goes around software development. I guess, to be completely rigorous, I know that there are frameworks like Astro and Quick out there, which would say that if you're building something that doesn't involve any interactivity, then you might not need a JavaScript framework at all. Maybe you should just build it as static HTML. and even outside the JavaScript community, obviously we have, you know, the Phoenix people and the Ruby on Rails people, and they would all say, don't bother with a JavaScript centric code base, just do things the old fashioned way. And that is also a legitimate answer. It's not an answer that I'm crazy about, because I don't think that that way of developing stuff scales particularly well. But you know, it is true that if you have a completely static page, or an application that is composed of completely static pages, and you don't have any need for JavaScript, then, you know, maybe you don't want to use a JavaScript framework.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, it reminds me of something you talked about before, with the differences between SPAs and the multi-page applications, and what you call the transitional applications. I've got a question here, which is asking about, you know, if we're able to basically make JavaScript unnecessary for some web applications, do you think we're going to see a migration to other languages? And is the internet going to have a kind of overhaul at some point, where we kind of get a new structure to it?
So I actually think the opposite is happening. There's a couple of converging trends at the moment that I think are setting the scene for even more developers to embrace JavaScript for all different kinds of applications. Specifically, front-end frameworks like Svelte, and also React and Vue and Solid and all of these other things, they have these companion meta frameworks. In Svelte's case, we have this thing called SvelteKit. And these are frameworks that run on the server as well as in the browser. So that the front-end technology is kind of claiming back-end territory. At the same time, the back-end is becoming more hospitable to front-end developers, because instead of having to provision servers and manage them, nowadays you will just deploy some code to a serverless function. Or in many cases, like, you can deploy your code to an edge function that will run in data centers all around the world. So like, it runs instantly no matter where your users are. And so like your typical serverless function, think AWS Lambda, that runs in Node. But edge functions, they use the same web APIs that are available in the front end. And so if you know JavaScript, then you're essentially a full stack developer nowadays. Just using the same web APIs front to back, you can build these very rich applications. Whereas if you're a Ruby developer and you think that Ruby on Rails is the way to go, then as soon as you have some interactivity, then you have to figure out how to do that. And so you're splitting your code base in two. You have the backend that renders the HTML, and then you have, like, they'll call it the sprinkles of JavaScript. And as the sprinkles turn into something more expansive, like your application gets more ambitious, then you end up having these completely two separate code bases. And so I think that the trend is very much towards using JavaScript frameworks to build applications. And that doesn't mean that we're running more JavaScript in the browser, quite the opposite. The trend is very much towards running the JavaScript at the edge or in the serverless function, so that it doesn't need to run in the browser. I think there's a pretty widespread acknowledgement these days that single page apps have largely failed as a way of building websites, precisely because all of the computation happens in the browser, when in reality, web apps are distributed systems, and a lot of the computation, at least initially, shouldn't be happening in the browser. I'm waffling a little bit. I'm rambling, but I guess what I'm trying to say here is that the way that the trends are going at the moment, I definitely don't think that we're going to see a decline in JavaScript as the language in which people build apps. But I do think that we're going to see a decline in the amount of JavaScript that is running in the browser, as people embrace better solutions than single page app frameworks.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, speaking of the future, do you have any, I mean, I'm sure you do. If you were given, let's say, unlimited resources, time, if you need, what would you want for Svelte? You know, what's your vision for in the ideal scenario, you know, in terms of usage and in terms of features?
So usage we don't really care about that much. um, we care about it to the extent that the number going up is a good sign that people enjoy using it and they're telling other people about it, and people are not like stopping using it. And from that perspective, the numbers have been very healthy for us over the last few years. Like, it does seem that adoption is growing, but in absolute terms, we're still minuscule compared to React and Vue. And that is totally fine, because if you optimize for adoption, then you will sacrifice the things that actually matter, I think, in software development. And as I said before, it isn't a zero-sum game. I don't think. We're, like I said in the documentary that you mentioned, that I say at the end of it, like, we would rather have something that a small number of people love than something that a large number of people tolerate. And I would, obviously there's like ego involved in open source, and everyone wants their thing to like have all of the GitHub stars and everything, but it's really not the important thing. And so we don't have any goals for usage, although I should say that my employer does have some goals for usage, and I guess I need to care about this, because ultimately like, I'm getting paid a salary to work on this stuff, and the number needs to keep going up, or maybe I won't get paid a salary to work on this stuff. So yeah, that's how we feel about adoption. In terms of like the vision, the roadmap, we talk a lot about specific features that we like and things that we want to implement, but we don't talk a lot about like an end game, so to speak. Obviously at the moment, SvelteKit is the big priority, because without that, there isn't actually an official way to build Svelte apps. And that's been something that's been missing for a long time. Once SvelteKit is done, then we think we can say, okay, so this is how you build Svelte apps. And a lot of the questions that people post on places like Stack Overflow, like, how do I use library X with Svelte? Like, these questions, they're very often asking, like, how do I use library X with whatever esoteric build system I've cobbled together in order to use Svelte, which is not the same thing. And if people are generally using the meta framework, then it means that we can start to offer a lot more help and support around those questions, because everyone will actually just be using Vite. And so having a more consistent experience will, I think, make it a lot easier for people to share their experiences and frustrations and solutions and all the rest of it. And so that's something that I'm really looking forward to having. But that's definitely not an end game in and of itself. The reason that we work on this project is because we want to maximize the number of people who are able to build interactive applications on the web. We think the web is pretty cool, and we think that, as like our generation, we are the stewards of the most important communications medium ever created, and we want it to be a read-write medium as opposed to a read-only medium. And making it accessible to the largest number of people is a key part of that. And I think there's a limit to how far you can push that when you're working within the confines of code. We want to make the code as easy as possible to write. We want people to be able to use their existing HTML, CSS, and JavaScript skills. But ultimately, we're still telling people to either download a code editor and figure out how to use the terminal and the command line and Node and these other things, or like, here's a website where you can go and you can type your code into a little box on the right and it'll appear on the little box on the left, or vice versa. But ultimately, that doesn't empower people like designers to work with the framework. So I think, not in the immediate future, but maybe 2 or 3 years from now, we'll be having some serious thoughts about whether it's possible to build a WYSIWYG environment for building these full stack applications. and not in like the no code Webflow sense where it is like a little over optimized for the design use case, and is kind of less mindful of the situations in which you need to drop into the code layer. But those are the kinds of things that when we start to get a little bit pie in the sky, those are the things that we think about. It's like how can we make it so easy to build SvelteKit apps that anyone can do it? I don't know, maybe we're gonna have like AIs writing our components for us. We've already seen like the beginnings of that with GPT-3 writing React components. Like maybe that's what the future of building applications looks like. But this is all like far in the future. For now, we're laser focused on getting SvelteKit 1 done.
So you mentioned you'd rather have a smaller number of people that absolutely love it as opposed to a bunch of people that just tolerate it. And you've definitely achieved the love in the Svelte community. I mean, the Svelte community is so bananas for the products. Is there anything that you can point to specifically you think that is the reason the community is so strong, or is it just the general how well the thing was built, or is there something that you think was kind of a particular, I don't know, cultivator of the community and how positive it is?
That's a really good question. I think a lot of it is possibly luck. Like communities tend to form around specific individuals who are very skilled at building communities. And I think about like Swix, who created Svelte Society, and all of the people who've been involved in that. I think about Brittany Postma, who created Svelte Sirens, which is like a community of people using Svelte who identify as women, non-binary. And there's like people who have really taken the lead in like building a space where people can feel welcome and people can share the things that they're excited about and all the rest of it. We also have like 6 monthly conferences where people can share like the stuff that they've been doing, and there's a global network of local meetups that are less so during the pandemic, but that's been a thing too. And I think that so much of it is down to just individual people saying like, I want to be a part of growing this community and spreading the word. But I think the design of the framework is also partly responsible in that we've very explicitly made design choices that that are designed to make people who maybe feel like they got left behind by some of the front end tooling complexity of the last few years, that they feel included by this tool. I know a lot of people, particularly coming from a newsroom environment where a lot of people who write code do so as a means to an end, not because they love writing JavaScript, but because JavaScript enables them to do better journalism or different journalism. These people, and I very much empathize with this, they don't care about configuring Webpack. They do not want to read the Babel documentation. And so much of the front end open source culture over the last few years has been like very geared towards okay, these are all of the things that you need to learn first, and then once you've managed to diagnose these cryptic Webpack errors, then we'll show you how to use our thing. And we reject that. We've taken pains to make Svelte as accessible as possible, including making sure that the documentation is something that people can interact with without developing any of that expertise. We have this interactive tutorial on the Svelte website where people can try the framework without downloading anything. And I think like a combination of all of those factors is at play. But truly, I don't know. It's a mystery to me how open source communities really work and why some have a particular character and others don't. it's probably also a function of the fact that we are still fairly small, and there's a little bit of a kind of an underdoggy feel to the community. Yeah, I don't know. I'd love to hear other people's opinions on why that's the case.
Yeah, so somebody just put in the chat talking about the syntax and how it makes much more sense than React, and that could be a reason why it's very popular. And I definitely agree that the syntax is super intuitive and straightforward. This is kind of, I guess, not a random question, but maybe a stretch. Do you think that there is a connection in how you're talking about not wanting necessarily the super complex documentation, and you've got an extremely straightforward and intuitive syntax? Is there a connection to those things and why you started in journalism and kind of this straightforward communication? Has that always been something that you were passionate about? This kind of, I don't know, getting ideas across in this kind of most efficient way as possible? Or is that something that's always been in your life?
Very possibly. I haven't really thought about it in those terms, but you know, the goal of journalism is to take a complex world and make it understandable. And so yeah, I guess there is there are certain habits of thought that you develop if your job is literally to distill information that way. Like I remember back in journalism school, in order to pass the exam, we had to take all of these different pieces of information and then write a story about it in 300 words or less. And like, say there's 20 pieces of information that you got to get in somehow, and if you miss any of them, then you're going to get dinged. If your word count is too long, you're going to get dinged. And it turns out it's incredibly hard. And so like the habits of thought that you develop in that environment, I think are probably beneficial in this context too. I would say that like a thing that I share with the rest of the Svelte core team, and which, you know, candidly not everyone in software development does share, is we just hate complexity. Like I for one, I feel like I have a very low threshold. I get bored easily. My eyes glaze over a lot of times when I'm learning a new technology. You know, it's the reason that I haven't yet got round to learning any language other than JavaScript and TypeScript, is because like I'm just like, I don't think I'm smart enough to like learn how to use a lot of the things that people use in software. And so, you know, if you have that instinctive reaction, like, no, this is too much, this is too complex, this is unnecessary, this doesn't feel right, then I think you will naturally end up rejecting designs that involve unnecessary complexity. The trick is to make things as simple as they can be, but no simpler, because sometimes it's possible to make things too simple, and then you lose flexibility and power in the process. But yeah, if I have one piece of advice for software developers, it's like develop the ability, like develop the sense of taste that says, no, this is too complex, we need to rethink this. Because it is very easy to let complexity creep into software, and once it's there, you will not get rid of it.
You studied philosophy at UCL, is that correct?
Yep, I did. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not sure why.
I also studied philosophy, and I'm also not sure why, but when you were talking about a lot of your frameworks or thought process in terms of distilling complex things, it just reminded me of that. So we're coming up to sort of towards the end of our questions here, and this is one that I'm looking forward to the answer to. What makes you feel alive when it comes to code, and what keeps you going in that world? It's
like solving puzzles. You know, when you're waiting for the subway and like you'll open a Sudoku or something, like it just scratches an itch that I think a lot of those of us who are drawn to programming experience. There's just something really satisfying about like writing a really elegant function that solves a specific problem. And so even though there's a lot of frustration involved in programming, there's a lot of like banging your head against a brick wall. There's a lot of stuff that is less fun to deal with, like, oh, my GitHub actions are failing and I need to diagnose that, but I can't run them locally, and like stuff like that, which is kind of miserable. Like every day that you're writing code, you're getting like this steady like run of like mini dopamine hits as you solve problems. And I think that's probably what it is. It's like it's almost an addiction. Like if you have the kind of brain that is rewarded by solving those sorts of problems, then programming is just a great field to be in. With Svelte specifically, it's always incredibly rewarding to see the things that people have built with something that you have a hand in maintaining. Like knowing that there are people who were able to build a particular site or a product, who like either they wouldn't have done it without Svelte or it would have been done in a different way. Like that is also intensely rewarding. And so both at like the macro level of like the sequence of dopamine hits and the macro level of like feeling like this work that we do is contributing to society in some way, combined to make it a very satisfying endeavor.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. The kind of modular goalpost you hit, very satisfying, and then the overall product you can see has an impact, of course, is going to be satisfying as well.
Like everyone loves ticking items off to-do lists, right? And the way that software engineering works these days is like it happens in a GitHub issue list and with GitHub pull requests, and that is literally a to-do list. And inside those issues, you'll often have smaller to-do lists. And so like even when you're not writing code, you're checking items off a to-do list. And for a certain kind of mind, that is just it just feels so good.
Is that part of the reason programmers are always building the to-do lists as practice apps? Is because we love
Probably,
just ticking
yeah.
things off the
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. So you're at Vercel now. Is there anything that you can tell us that's big on the horizon that you're working on? Anything that you can share with us that you're excited about?
So I'm in like a kind of an odd position at Vercel because I'm in a team of one. Although it'll be a team of two fairly soon. One of the core contributors to Svelte, Simon Holthausen, he is joining the company in about 3 weeks, I think. And so then there'll be two of us working on it full time. But because of that, like I'm not involved in any of the real work that happens at Vercel. Like there's a whole bunch of different products that Vercel maintains, and like I get to peek into the Slack channels and see what people are working on. And as a framework author, they'll often come to me and say, hey, we've got this new thing, we want it to work seamlessly with SvelteKit, can you try this beta version? And like we'll have some meetings and see what works and what doesn't. But like a lot of there's either stuff that I've heard rumors about but can't yet talk about, or it's the same stuff that that everyone's using. I'm just like a privileged user of that stuff because I have the ability to DM the people responsible for building it. So I think the big thing for the company that's coming up soon is the general availability of edge functions and edge middleware. That's been this stuff has been in beta for quite some time, and the usage has just been absolutely phenomenal. There's like billions of requests served a day on this stuff, and that's about to become generally available out of beta, which the revenue people are very excited about because it means they can start charging for it. And I think that's the big stuff. There's also huge changes coming to Next.js soon. This big new approach to routing, which is going to make a lot of people very happy. And there's a lot of investment in Turbo at the moment as well, which is this way of scaling people's mono repos to infinity without making build times unbearably slow. and a lot of that is like more and more of the work is happening in Rust at the moment. There's a lot of opportunities for Rust people right now. But beyond that, I don't really have any specifics that I can talk about, I don't think.
So you've dropped a couple of pieces of advice throughout this whole Q&A, which has been amazing. But I'm wondering if you have anything specific that, I mean, we've got a room full of people who are relatively new to coding. Is there anything that you would want to impart on your younger self, let's say? Anything that you wish you had known? Yeah, what advice would you give the young Rich Harris?
The advice I always give to people who are new to programming is like, find a buddy. Programming is kind of a solitary activity, but the more that you can spend time either pair programming or like having someone that you can ask questions of and like bounce ideas back and forth with, the better it'll go. Because it's so easy for like a single invisible syntax error to ruin your day. And the minute that you can get someone else be like, oh, have you looked at line 17 there? That looks wrong. Or like, have you tried this library? Or, you know, what about this data structure? The better it'll go. I think that probably applies less to this audience than most because you already have each other. But my advice would be like, capitalize on that. Really make use of the fact that you have this community of people who can empathize with whatever frustrations you're experiencing. Because, you know, not everyone has that. And to me, it's all the difference between someone who will get frustrated with programming and leave the industry and people who can actually become successful.
Great, thank you. I mean, yeah, Codesmith thankfully has got a great community, and everybody's usually working in pairs and or groups, and so it's definitely very helpful. We'll keep that in mind for sure. I know it's not the Codesmith style, but we might end a few minutes early. If there's anything else you want to share with the classes that are here, anything else you want to say, you can go ahead. But if not,
no, just it's been great getting to talk to you all. If you have follow-up questions, then, you know, just yell at me on Twitter or whatever. And see you around.
All right, and can we all unmute right now and give Rich Harris a round of applause as a thank you? Give him some love in the chat, perhaps.
Thank you, Rich Harris. So great.
Thank you so much, Rich.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, and again, thank you so much. I hope you have a good rest of the day. This was amazing. It was so nice to speak to you and so nice to meet you.
Yeah, likewise. Cheerio.